The global economic landscape was rocked by an unexpected shift when Canada, a historically close trade partner of the United States, moved decisively to replace American imports with those from China and the European Union. This dramatic change came in response to newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump's sudden imposition of sweeping tariffs on trade partners, a move that sent shockwaves through international markets and upended long-standing economic relationships. For decades, Canada and the United States had maintained a deeply interwoven trade system, with supply chains crossing borders seamlessly. However, this new policy from Washington forced Canada to make a strategic pivot that stunned both economic analysts and political observers. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The announcement of tariffs was met with swift and calculated action from Canadian leaders, who recognized the immediate threat to their country's economy. With American imports suddenly burdened by increased costs, the Canadian government wasted no time in seeking alternative trade partners. China and the European Union, both eager to strengthen their economic ties with Canada, saw an opportunity to fill the void left by the United States. What followed was an aggressive reworking of trade agreements, new import contracts, and a diversification of supply chains that fundamentally altered Canada's economic trajectory. Canada's decision to shift away from American imports was not simply a retaliatory measure, but a necessary step to protect its economy. With U.S. tariffs making American goods less competitive, businesses across Canada faced the risk of rising costs, supply chain disruptions, and declining profit margins. Rather than absorbing these financial burdens, Canadian industries quickly adapted by seeking more favorable trade arrangements with other economic powerhouses. This shift not only ensured the stability of Canada's supply chains, but also strengthened its negotiating position on the global stage, proving that the country was no longer willing to be economically dependent on the United States, a cornerstone of both the Canadian and American economies. For years, Canada had relied heavily on American-made automobile components and vehicles, with factories operating in tandem across the border. However, with tariffs significantly raising the cost of these imports, Canadian automakers turned to European and Chinese manufacturers. Germany, with its world-class engineering and well-established automobile industry, luxury brands such as BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen, gained increased traction in the Canadian market, while Chinese automakers eager to expand their global reach secured lucrative contracts to supply affordable electric vehicles and key auto components. Beyond automobiles, other major industries also saw a radical shift. Agriculture, another deeply interconnected sector between Canada and the United States, faced significant changes. Historically, Canadian grocery stores had been filled with American produce, dairy, and meat products. But with tariffs in place, the cost of these goods soared, forcing Canada to seek alternative suppliers. The European Union stepped in with its vast agricultural network, offering dairy products from France, fresh produce from Spain, and premium meats from Italy. Meanwhile, China's massive agricultural industry provided an influx of fruits, vegetables, and seafood at competitive prices. Canadian consumers, once accustomed to American food products, quickly adjusted to the influx of new international options on their supermarket shelves. The energy sector was another domain where Canada's shift had profound implications. The United States had long been one of Canada's primary suppliers of refined petroleum products, natural gas, and energy-related machinery. But as trade barriers increased, Canada explored new partnerships with European energy firms and Chinese technology companies specializing in renewable energy. China, already a global leader in solar panel production and battery storage technology, quickly filled the gap, helping Canada accelerate its transition toward green energy solutions. European companies, particularly from Norway and Denmark, provided expertise in wind energy, further strengthening Canada's move away from dependence on American energy imports. As Canadian industries embraced these new partnerships, it became clear that this was more than just a short-term response to tariffs. It was a fundamental realignment of economic priorities. Canadian businesses found themselves developing deeper ties with European and Chinese companies, forming relationships that were unlikely to be abandoned even if U.S. policies later shifted. This was a significant moment in Canada's economic history, marking a departure from its traditional reliance on the American market and signaling a future of diversified trade relationships. Politically, the shift carried significant weight. Canada's move to distance itself from American imports was widely viewed as a strong message to Washington. While Canada had long been a reliable ally to the United States, this sudden pivot underscored its willingness to prioritize national economic security over traditional alliances. This strategic independence demonstrated that Canada was not merely a passive participant in North American trade, but a proactive player on the global economic stage. The move also strengthened Canada's relationships with China and the European Union, both of which welcomed the opportunity to deepen their economic ties with a stable and resource-rich nation. The realignment also raised questions about the future of North American trade agreements. With Canada forging stronger relationships outside the continent, the viability of previous trade frameworks, such as the USMCA United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, came into question. If Canada could secure more favorable terms with Europe and China, what incentive remained to prioritize trade with the United States? This shift had the potential to fundamentally reshape North American economic structures, with the possibility of other U.S. trade partners reconsidering their own relationships with Washington. For American businesses, the consequences of Canada's decision were severe. Many U.S. companies that had long relied on Canada as a primary market suddenly found themselves losing customers to European and Chinese competitors. American agricultural producers, automobile manufacturers, and technology firms faced declining sales as Canadian buyers turned elsewhere. The abrupt shift in trade dynamics forced U.S. businesses to either absorb the financial hit or scramble to find new international markets to replace lost Canadian revenue. The changes also had a psychological impact on U.S. economic policymakers. For years, the United States had assumed that its economic influence over Canada was virtually unshakable. The notion that Canada could swiftly reorient its trade relationships caught many in Washington off guard, highlighting the limitations of protectionist policies. The realization that longtime allies could adapt and move away from American economic dominance challenged assumptions about the effectiveness of unilateral tariff measures. Canada's realignment toward China and the European Union also had broader geopolitical implications. Strengthening economic ties with China positioned Canada as an even more attractive partner for Beijing, which sought to expand its influence in North America. The European Union, already engaged in numerous trade disputes with the United States, saw Canada's shift as an opportunity to solidify an economic alliance that could counterbalance American policies. These new alignments had the potential to shift global trade power dynamics, reducing Washington's leverage in future negotiations. The Canadian public, initially wary of such a significant change, gradually embraced the shift as they saw tangible benefits. With greater access to high-quality European goods, competitively priced Chinese products, and more diversified options in industries ranging from technology to agriculture, consumers recognized that this realignment offered advantages beyond just escaping tariff burdens. Canadian businesses, too, found that greater engagement with global markets enhanced innovation, competition, and economic resilience. Even as Canada's move stunned the United States, it underscored an essential reality of modern trade. Economic alliances are not set in stone. Countries will always act in their own best interests, and when faced with policies that threaten their economic stability, they will seek alternatives. Canada's swift and strategic response to U.S. tariffs demonstrated the agility and adaptability of its economy, ensuring that it was not held hostage by any single trade partner. This shift also served as a warning to other nations considering similar protectionist measures. It highlighted the risks of assuming that long-standing trade partners would simply accept unfavorable terms without seeking alternatives. Canada's ability to swiftly realign its trade relationships showed that economic interdependence is fluid, and nations must carefully weigh the potential consequences of policies that disrupt established trade networks. As Canada continued to strengthen its new economic partnerships, the full impact of this transformation was still unfolding. The consequences of replacing American imports with those from China and the European Union were profound, reshaping industries, altering global trade relationships, and challenging assumptions about economic dependencies. In a world where trade is more interconnected than ever, Canada's bold move demonstrated that even the closest of economic relationships could shift in an instant when national interests demanded it. The implications of Canada's dramatic shift away from American imports extended far beyond the initial economic realignment. This was not just a short-term reaction to new tariffs, but a decisive transformation that fundamentally reshaped Canada's trade policies, industrial strategies, and diplomatic relationships. As Canada deepened its partnerships with China and the European Union, the long-term ramifications of this move became increasingly evident, altering the balance of economic power and influencing industries in ways that went beyond simple trade figures. One of the most striking effects of this shift was the acceleration of infrastructure development to accommodate new supply chains. For decades, Canada's transportation and logistics networks had been primarily oriented towards facilitating trade with the United States. Highways, rail lines, and ports were optimized for the rapid movement of goods across the US-Canada border. However, with trade now pivoting towards China and Europe, major investments were required to strengthen alternative routes. Canadian ports on the Pacific coast, such as Vancouver and Prince Rupert, saw an immediate surge in activity as they became the primary gateways for imports from China. These ports were already among the busiest in North America. The government and private investors funneled billions into modernizing port facilities, upgrading rail networks to transport goods efficiently into the heart of Canada, and expanding road infrastructure to accommodate increased truck traffic. Meanwhile, on the Atlantic coast, ports like Halifax and Montreal saw significant upgrades to support increased trade with the European Union. New logistics hubs were developed to facilitate faster customs clearance, ensuring that European goods could reach Canadian markets with minimal delays. With the trade shift came a reconfiguration of Canada's manufacturing sector. Many Canadian businesses that had previously relied on American suppliers for raw materials and components now turned to European and Chinese counterparts. This transition required rapid adaptation and retooling of production lines. Factories that had once been designed around American specifications had to adjust to European standards and Chinese manufacturing processes. Engineers and technicians worked tirelessly to ensure compatibility with new imported components, often redesigning entire production systems to accommodate different specifications. The impact was especially pronounced in the technology sector, where supply chains had long been tightly integrated with American firms. Previously, Canadian technology companies sourced many of their components from Silicon Valley and other U.S. hubs, benefiting from close proximity and regulatory alignment. With tariffs driving up costs, Canadian firms pivoted towards European and Chinese suppliers. This transition introduced new partnerships, with Canadian companies forming closer ties with European semiconductor manufacturers and Chinese electronics firms. European technology leaders, particularly those in Germany and the Netherlands, saw an opportunity to expand their influence in North America by providing cutting-edge components and R&D collaborations. Meanwhile, Chinese tech giants such as Huawei and Xiaomi sought to deepen their presence in the Canadian market, offering advanced telecommunications infrastructure and consumer electronics. Beyond the immediate business implications, the trade shift also influenced Canada's labor market. The transition away from American imports meant that Canadian workers needed to develop expertise in dealing with different manufacturing standards, regulatory frameworks, and business practices. As a result, universities and technical colleges across Canada quickly adapted their curricula to prepare students for this new economic landscape. Engineering programs began incorporating European regulatory standards. Trade schools offered courses on Chinese manufacturing processes, and business schools expanded their international trade programs to focus on the growing economic ties with Asia and Europe. At the same time, the shift also created new job opportunities. The expansion of ports and logistics hubs required a massive influx of workers, from dock workers to supply chain analysts. Manufacturing plants that had retooled for European and Chinese imports needed skilled labor to manage new machinery and production methods. Meanwhile, the growth of international trade required more bilingual professionals, with an increasing demand for workers fluent in Mandarin, German, French, and other European languages to facilitate smoother business operations. Canada's financial sector also adapted to the changing trade environment. With a decrease in American imports, Canadian banks and investment firms shifted their focus towards supporting businesses engaged in trade with Europe and China. Financing mechanisms were developed to help companies manage currency fluctuations, as transactions in euros and yuan became more commonplace. Insurance companies adjusted their policies to account for the risks associated with longer shipping routes and different regulatory environments. Additionally, stock markets saw increased activity in companies that stood to benefit from the trade realignment, with logistics firms, port operators, and manufacturers catering to European and Asian markets experiencing significant growth. The shift away from American imports also had a profound impact on Canada's small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. Many of these businesses had previously relied on U.S. suppliers due to proximity and convenience. With the introduction of tariffs, they were forced to explore new supply chains and establish direct relationships with European and Chinese partners. This transition was challenging, as it required overcoming language barriers, navigating different regulatory landscapes, and renegotiating supply contracts. However, those businesses that successfully adapted found themselves with access to a broader and more competitive range of suppliers. Some Canadian SMEs even expanded their operations by forming joint ventures with European and Chinese firms, leading to increased innovation and market diversification. On the diplomatic front, Canada's decision to replace American imports with Chinese and European goods sent a powerful message. While historically aligned with the United States on economic and geopolitical matters, Canada now demonstrated its willingness to pursue an independent trade policy that prioritized national economic interests over traditional alliances. This newfound autonomy elevated Canada's standing in global trade negotiations, allowing it to engage with China and the European Union on more equal footing. China, eager to solidify its economic foothold in North America, responded by strengthening diplomatic ties with Canada. High-level trade delegations were exchanged, and new agreements were signed to facilitate smoother business operations. China also increased its investments in Canadian infrastructure projects, particularly in transportation and energy sectors, further deepening economic interdependence. The European Union similarly saw Canada's shift as an opportunity to strengthen transatlantic trade ties. With Brexit altering the dynamics of European trade, Canada's decision to move closer to the EU provided a timely boost for European exporters. European governments actively promoted trade missions to Canada, encouraging businesses to seize the opportunity created by the decline in American imports. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the EU, which had already laid the foundation for increased trade, saw an expansion in its scope as more Canadian businesses sought European alternatives to American goods. Canada's consumer market also underwent noticeable changes as a result of the trade realignment. With European and Chinese goods becoming more prominent, Canadian consumers were introduced to new brands, products, and pricing structures. In the automotive sector, for instance, German and Chinese manufacturers expanded their presence, leading to increased competition and greater consumer choice. European fashion brands, already popular in Canada, gained even more traction as retailers stocked more EU-made apparel and accessories. Chinese electronics and home appliances became more widely available, often at lower prices than their American counterparts, making them attractive alternatives for Canadian buyers. Despite the benefits, the transition was not without challenges. The shift away from American imports required businesses and consumers to adapt to new products, regulatory standards, and logistical complexities. Some industries faced temporary disruptions as they adjusted to new supply chains, and certain sectors struggled with unfamiliar regulatory hurdles when dealing with European and Chinese suppliers. Additionally, there were concerns about quality control, particularly with Chinese imports, as Canadian regulators worked to ensure that products met national safety and environmental standards. There were also broader geopolitical concerns about increasing dependence on China. While China provided Canada with an essential alternative to American imports, some policymakers worried about the long-term implications of becoming too reliant on Chinese goods. The Chinese government's history of using economic leverage for political purposes raised questions about how much influence China might exert over Canada in the future. To mitigate this risk, Canadian leaders took steps to ensure that trade relationships remained balanced emphasizing the importance of diversification and maintaining strong ties with the European Union. Despite these challenges, Canada's decision to replace American imports with those from China and the EU marked a defining moment in its economic history. The shift was more than just a response to U.S. tariffs. It was a strategic move that set Canada on a new path of economic independence and global integration. By embracing a more diversified trade portfolio, Canada reduced its vulnerability to U.S. economic policies and positioned itself as a more resilient player in the global marketplace. As this transformation continued to unfold, the long-term effects became increasingly clear. Canada's infrastructure, manufacturing sector, labor market, financial institutions, and diplomatic relations had all been reshaped by this historic realignment. The move not only strengthened Canada's economy, but also demonstrated its ability to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing global landscape. This bold shift sent a clear message to the world. Canada was no longer content to be merely a secondary player in North American trade. It was now a fully engaged participant in the broader international economic arena, ready to forge its own path forward. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Canada shifting to China and EU for imports after Trump's tariffs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.